Welcome back to the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. I am Brian Morgenstern here with the great Sam Lyman. And I think before we get into some very heavy topics, I need to compliment Sam on his fashion this week. You look great. It is also reminiscent of one of my favorite SNL sketches from the 90s called Sprockets, where very sleek German models with their black and their gray, their muted tones, to emphasize their chiseled features. Dylan, do you have a clip? No, we don't have a clip. But do yourself a favor and Google sprockets, and you will find out that this is the time on sprockets when we dance. It's the best. Anyway, great outfit. We got a lot of very important topics to talk about. So what should we dive into first?
Well, with that, real quick on sprockets, I guess it was also an inspiration for Zoolander. So,
Yes, blue steel.
I'll give my best blue steel face for the camera, though.
Yes. Oh, solid.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. All right. So, sprockets, Zoolander, now Congress and Bitcoin. So, Brian, to kick off today, a lot happened over the weekend. The House passed a $95 billion foreign aid package that included spending to help Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. And it was a really interesting scene on the House floor when this legislation passed because dozens of senators had Ukraine flags in hand, and they were waving these Ukraine flags as the votes were going through when it became clear that this foreign aid package was going to pass. And there was a chant on the House floor of the United States of America. The chant was, Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. So a very interesting scene. And Dylan, I think you have it. Of $35 trillion in national debt, a new high that keeps to climb higher and higher. So, Brian, what do you make of this scene? I think there's an awful lot to unpack here.
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack. And at first I was thinking, chanting Ukraine, Ukraine. In the House, I would hope it would be USA, USA. But if they want to be accurate in terms of, I think what the American people are thinking, it should be out of touch, out of touch. Like, and this is not, judging the merits of, Putin's invasion. Like nobody's in favor of that. But we have tremendous issues here in America. Our representatives are supposed to first and foremost represent Americans, and yet we have a wide open border. If you haven't visited the border, it is heartbreaking. It is infuriating, and yet the administration has decided to open it up, which is empowering drug traffickers. It's allowing human trafficking. It is causing tremendous suffering. We're now seeing, problems in most of America's major cities because of it. They're not addressing that. They're not addressing issues that are impacting the American people. They're focused on things that are halfway around the world. Not that they're not important, but I think the American people are seeing some misplaced priorities here. And you mentioned the national debt. It's increasing faster than ever. And if you want to really kind of destroy faith in the American government and in the strength of the U.S. dollar, a lot of the actions we're seeing, I think, is doing just that. We're not only sending $100 billion overseas when we have problems here at home, we're also we're racking up unsustainable levels in our own government without actually solving problems that are pressing. So we've talked before about how the top four expenditures are the service on the debt itself, interest, Medicare, Social Security, and the defense industrial complex. And those expenses alone are more than the tax receipts that the federal government is taking in. Then you factor in the whole rest of the government, now another $100 billion going to other countries. I think a lot of the American people are saying, what are they doing? Like, who's representing me? And there's more packed into that bill. It's not just the foreign aid. It was the TikTok ban. It was the Repo Act. Of course, not a lot has to do with solving problems for the American people. And yet here the members of Congress they're cheering for themselves for doing something. But the American people, again, are sitting at home saying, what are you doing for me? Like, you're supposed to represent me. So it's really a moment, I believe, that illustrates the disconnect between Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country. And this disconnect, I mean, it's probably part of why Trump won in 2016, right? I mean, it's were ready to knock over the apple cart. They said the government's not doing anything for me. So they seem to have not learned their lesson at this point. I don't know. That was my initial reaction to it. It's bizarre.
Yeah, absolutely bizarre. I think the scene speaks to an emerging divide in American politics, and that divide is between neoliberals and the rest, or you could say people who have a political agenda that's centered on free trade and globalization, and people who have a political agenda that's focused more on populism, on building up our manufacturing base here at home, on what can be succinctly described as America first. I think that divide was loud and clear in Congress this weekend. And that's not to say anything of the need for Ukraine to defend themselves. I'm not going to diminish that at all, because Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a travesty in every way. But at the same time, this is tens of billions of dollars going towards a country with very little oversight at the same time. And the waving of the Ukraine flag almost seemed like I think it speaks to the fact that there's a very strong agenda centered on globalism within the U.S. Congress right now, and I think it will make the election coming up this year in November. It will make it even more prescient, or even more pronounced, this divide between America first and people who have the neoliberal agenda that was very dominant in the 90s and 2000s, and I think is sort of waning in popularity, at least in terms of the American voter today. And so I couldn't agree more, Brian. There's a huge divide there. And you also mentioned that there were many pieces of legislation tucked into this legislation, right? And one of those things is the Repo Act. So a quick summary of the Repo Act. In February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and some of our allies in Western Europe actually froze Russian assets that were being stored or being held in American banks and banks in Europe. Cumulatively, we froze over $300 billion in Russian assets. That includes $6 billion of Russian assets that are held in banks here in the United States. So the Repo Act goes a step further and says not only are we going to seize these assets, we're actually going to appropriate them. We're going to take these frozen funds and we are going to give them to Ukraine to help in the rebuilding effort of Ukraine. So it's a huge escalation in the politicization and the weaponization of the US dollar. And again, I think there's a lot to unpack with the Repo Act. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the Repo Act and what this means for the future of US dollar dominance.
Yeah, I think this is a great example. And this will be a thread, I think, that goes through a number of the important issues we're discussing today. Congress frequently acts on impulse for instant gratification in service of a nice sounding gimmick, but in a way that is going to have long-term negative consequences. I mean, on the one hand, who would argue with you're taking assets from Vladimir Putin's country and giving it to the country he invaded? Doesn't that feel like some kind of poetic justice? But look at it in terms of precedent and where it could go from here. You have now Western countries deciding that we're going to take all your money, person that we don't like, and we're going to give it to this person that we do like. That will have sweeping ramifications. There's been some writing on this that is very unprecedented, and it's a pretty dangerous move. And when you think about a lot of the human rights activists in Eastern Europe who are transacting in Bitcoin, when you think about Americans who are losing trust in our institutions, who are holding Bitcoin for that reason because they don't want to trust third parties anymore. Now we have the risk of, and again, not a defense of Putin, it is a defense of longer term thinking, that if you have a system where you're just going to seize assets from somebody you don't like and give it to somebody that you do like, then it's very hard to have any trust. And so that's why, the kind of Bitcoiner slogan is don't trust, verify, where you don't have to trust a bank, you don't have to trust a government. You can just hold your assets on chain in a cold storage wallet, another topic that we can get into because the government's messing with it. I just think that it's, once again, Congress kind of acting in service of like a media narrative or a gimmick without regard for the longer term effects. This is going to make American debt much less attractive. When we need it to be attractive, we need it to be viewed as kind of the reserve asset, because otherwise, we could go really into a debt spiral. We're already at 125% of GDP with our debt. So I just think this was politicians, trying to get headlines, but I think the long-term ramifications are extremely damaging to what they say they want to protect, which is the reserve status of the US dollar.
I agree. It's worth asking, did Congress break the US dollar this weekend? Let's go back all the way to February 22. Again, that's when Russia invaded Ukraine. It was truly unprecedented, the action amongst the US and our allies in Europe to freeze Russian assets in that way. And so it's one thing to freeze another country's assets. It's another thing to seize those assets. And that is what is about to take place if the Repo Act goes through the Senate, which it seems likely to do.
And reappropriate them.
Right.
To freeze them, seize them, and then give them to somebody else.
Right.
I mean, and without, by the way, any sort of any robust like due process. I mean, there's asset seizure in the United States, which many people have problems with the process, feel like it's borderline unconstitutional. But if it's done, I'll call it the right way, you at least are going through a process with a standard of proof, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, in a criminal case at least, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the assets being seized and given potentially to a victims fund or a restitution fund or something like that. It has to be proven that the funds were ill-gotten gains from criminal activity, and you have to go through something of a process here. This is not that. And this, I think, is setting up, like I said, sort of a dangerous precedence where the U.S. government can just pass, a new law in the heat of the moment, in the fog of war, as it were, and just declare, we don't like that guy, we like that guy, so we're taking all his stuff and giving it to him. Again, not a defense of Putin. It's just a defense of like basic process and fairness and what the U.S. is supposed to stand for. This doesn't feel like the right process to me at all. It feels dangerous.
Yeah, it feels incredibly dangerous because, again, Putin is a thug. Nobody wants to defend Putin. But I think if you zoom out here and you realize the long-term implications of this action, what we're doing with the Repo Act is we're politicizing the US dollar in a way that it hasn't been done before.
Yep.
We are the global reserve currency. And as the global reserve currency, other countries look to the US dollar as a safe haven asset of sorts. Historically, they've looked to it as something that they could turn to when the whole world was falling apart. But if this bill passes, which it looks likely to do, that won't be the case anymore. And you have to take into consideration other countries who aren't like Russia and aren't necessarily like China, but other countries who maybe are allied with the US on some matters, but not everything. So India might be an interesting example. Countries who toe a more neutral line on a lot of global issues, they're seeing this and they are losing confidence in the US dollar because what's happening is debanking on a nation state level.
Yes.
So we've seen debanking in countries across the Western world over the last few years, and it seems to be picking up as a trend. We've seen it here in the United States with people who are not aligned with the political establishment. There's been a lot of pressure to close bank accounts for people who, for example, support President Trump or have political views that are out of sync with the powers that be. We saw this in Canada, for example. During the Canada trucker protest, a lot of people were debanked in those situations. The issue is debanking Russia. Again, we do not support Russia, right? But you have to take into consideration, like you said, Brian, the precedent that this sets. What this is saying is, if this act goes through, is that the U.S. will have the authority going forward to debank any nation state that it wants. And who determines who is worthy of being debanked? That's an interesting question going forward. And so the US dollar has been weaponized, I think, in the last couple years in a way that I hope there's going back, but I'm not sure that there is.
And I think you said it right. And some of the BRICS countries are looking for alternatives now. We have Russia turning to China and using their currency for natural gas sales, other transactions. People are looking actively for alternatives because they don't want to be a slave to the dollar, because they thought it was a safe haven asset. That's kind of what it was designed to do back when it became the world reserve currency. What was it? Well, in the aftermath of World War II, and then there was Bretton Woods in the 70s. It was supposed to be the safest asset in the world, and where people could park their value and it would never be threatened. It's probably it's not a growth stock or anything like that, but it's supposed to be safe. And now if the US government's going to decide that they don't like you, therefore they're seizing all your US dollars, or your T-bills, or whatever it is, anything that touches the US financial system, anything that's in a bank. I agree. I think you're making the US dollar much less attractive, and people are going to speed up their search for alternatives. They're already searching pretty hard, but I think this sends a message that will wake up, like you say, others who are not necessarily in that kind of like axis that already hates the U.S., Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, like others who are looking for other ways to avoid touching the U.S. financial system, to avoid the U.S.'s dollar dominance. I do think this kind of wakes up others. We've already seen the Saudis, looking for alternatives to the petrodollar. It's a pretty dramatic move, and I think your everyday American probably doesn't think of it in those terms. Congress pursuing, in pursuit of the headline, and in pursuit of the short-term euphoria of, we really stuck it to the bad guy. I think this makes the foundation more fragile underneath the dollar. So, and there are a number of members of Congress who said that, by the way, during the course of the debate on this. They just didn't win the vote, obviously. There were too many things all packaged together so that it could just sail through. People weren't willing to vote against aid for Israel. They weren't willing to vote against, creating a stronger presence in the East to counter China. They looped this into something that made it very difficult to vote against. But there are some of these things in there that are going to have, I think, very negative long-term consequences. But we've beaten this horse a little bit to death.
Yeah, we probably have. Last question related to this topic, Brian. What does this all mean for Bitcoin, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's very bullish for Bitcoin. It makes me happy as a Bitcoiner. It makes me sort of sad as an American to see what the U.S., what our governing class is doing. The administration for giving student loans to the tune of, hundreds of billions of dollars, telling people that, you agreed to pay these things back, you took on the debt, but don't worry about it. We're just going to have that, wiped out and paid for by people who paid their loans or who didn't take loans out in the first place. I mean, incredibly unfair. That is a fiscal calamity. You're combining it with, as we said, $100 billion in foreign aid, where people see a border crisis at home and rampant inflation. You're going to print another $100 billion, but you're not even going to use it to solve domestic issues. I mean, we're in kind of an upside down world here with where policymakers, it just seems like up is down, down is up, good is bad, bad is good. That, I think, and then combine that with the Repo Act, where the U.S. is just going to start seizing assets and giving them to the people that they like. That is really weakening for the dollar. And so over the past several years, we've seen a really fast run up in Bitcoin, I think, because people are looking for assets where they don't have to trust a third party. They don't have to trust a government, or they don't have to trust a bank. I think this only strengthens that case, and it makes Bitcoin all the more valuable, particularly self-custodied Bitcoin. because that's harder for the government to get. So it's good for Bitcoin, but it makes me sad that I think our leaders are weakening the United States.
Yeah. And I hope we can turn things around, but we won't anytime soon if we continue on this trajectory. So, good news and bad news good news for Bitcoin, bad news for the US dollar. And hopefully, you want both those things to succeed together, both currencies to continue to increase their dominance. So, interestingly, Bitcoin and Wall Street are merging more and more together. As we've seen over the last 12 months, you've had a couple really big developments within the Bitcoin world and the world of traditional finance. Foremost among them being we had the approval of the Bitcoin ETF, and more we're seeing Bitcoin miners play a prominent role on Wall Street. And Ryan, you saw that up close and personal last Friday, which coincidentally, actually not coincidentally, I think it was by design on purpose, it was also the Bitcoin halving. So the day of the Bitcoin halving, Riot was invited to the NASDAQ stock exchange to ring the closing bell. It would be great for us to hear about your experience there up in New York City and the reputation of Bitcoin on Wall Street and the conversations you had with investors when you were out there. Can you shed a little bit of light on that?
Sure, absolutely. And Dylan, do you have the picture from the closing bell ceremony? There we are. There's the great team at Riot. It's a great ceremony. NASDAQ does a nice job. They have a host come in. They have an introductory video of why the exchange is so important. The exchange focused on innovation, and then they have a host give some nice remarks about the company and our landmark. Actually, it happened on the day of the halving, which is fantastic. We were also there to celebrate energizing Corsicana, which is the new Riot Bitcoin mining facility, which will be the largest in the world. Really impressive things that the Riot team has done down there. So it's great to celebrate that. So they have a host come in and give a nice talk about your company. Our CEO, of course, Jason gave wonderful remarks. And then we had a celebration and a countdown to the closing bell where we all were cheering and clapping like seals. And they had it broadcast on the side of the building in Times Square. So there was a nice 7-story picture of our team there. Of course, everybody, all the tourists in Times Square asking, who the heck are those people? But it was still fun. I think to answer your question about the convergence of Bitcoin and Wall Street, I think you can have your cake and eat it too, so to speak, because a lot of people want an easy user experience to get exposure to Bitcoin. They are learning more about it. It's not the easiest thing to understand. It wasn't the easiest thing for me to understand. A lot of the folks who want exposure to it now, again, are sort of learning about it. And it's not easy to like have a cold storage wallet and your own private keys and like to do it in the true Bitcoiner way. So I think it's okay for people to use the user experience that they're used to gain exposure to Bitcoin and learn more about it. I think it's critically important, though, to have the option of self-custody and to be able to not trust, verify, and hold your own assets. Be your own bank, to abuse some of the other cliches from the Bitcoin community. I think it's okay to have institutions involved. I just think you also need to continue to empower individual users. And that is where we can get into some of the policy debates that are now happening with regard to what the government's trying to define as a broker of assets and things like that. So I think it's great that these companies are being recognized as more mainstream institutions. It's terrific that you're seeing capital flow into the space for more innovation and more growth, and more people getting involved and more people gaining exposure. It's just also important that you maintain the self-sovereignty character of it as well. You need to preserve that optionality. But I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. That's just my take. I think other Bitcoiners who are more pure, I think, in their beliefs about it, are probably not happy about the institutions coming in. I view it as inevitable. If there's a good asset, if it's something that's a good investment that has value, clearly there are millions of people, tens of millions around the world of people who see the value of Bitcoin. I think it was inevitable that you were going to have institutions getting in on that. But I think that's okay. It facilitates more mass adoption. It facilitates more investment, more growth, more innovation. But you have to preserve the true character and self-sovereignty piece as well. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's interesting because Bitcoin has these really cool cypherpunk origins. It's a very anti-establishment project from the get-go. And so it's for a long time, since its inception, really, Bitcoin has been very cool, very countercultural. But there's a question: when something cool and countercultural becomes corporatized, will it lose some of that culture? I would posit that the internet is another example of something that's long been cool and countercultural. That was, of course, corporatized by Google, Facebook, the FANG companies, these big tech conglomerates. There's corners of the internet that are very normy. They're very corporate. They're very oriented around making money, turning a profit. But there's other corners of the internet that are still very punk, right? That are still pretty wild, pretty untamed, and very anti-establishment in their origins. So just the fact that you had emerging companies that built themselves on the internet doesn't mean that the internet itself lost its savor. And I think the same thing will happen with Bitcoin. And like you said, Brian, these two things aren't mutually exclusive. I don't think that there is a binary that exists between either we have a Bitcoin ETF and we lose Bitcoin's magic, or we do self-custody for the rest of forever. You can do both things at the same time. The fact that a Bitcoin ETF exists doesn't in any way preclude anyone from self-custodying their Bitcoin. And I agree with you as well that this is absolutely essential for Bitcoin to grow into a global asset class, to become what it was always meant to be. And of course, I think it just underscores ever more the need to custody your own Bitcoin if you want to maintain those cypherpunk origins that really drove the movement from day one. And so you mentioned as well, Brian, that to the extent that Bitcoin will remain cypherpunk, it's kind of a policy question. This battle is taking place on a policy level. And there was a really interesting development last week when the IRS updated their 1099-A form. So I don't want to get into like tax specifics, but just to break it down really simply for people, the 1099-A form is the form that people who hold crypto need to fill out in order to report their tax obligations to the IRS. What was notable about this updated form that the IRS has circulated, and again, it's a draft, so it's not official yet, that's important to remember. But what was notable about this new form is that it classifies unhosted wallets as brokers. So this is a big deal, and we don't want to get too wonky here, but Brian, can you walk us through first, what is an unhosted wallet? What is a broker? And why is this a big deal in the Bitcoin community?
Yeah, it's an important issue that I think it's a little bit wonky and is a little bit sort of inside baseball, but it's an important one. So, and it ties into the last question about whether it's okay for institutions to be so involved in Bitcoin. So an unhosted wallet is a device where you can hold your own Bitcoin without an institution, without an exchange, without your Coinbase account or River or wherever you may strike or wherever you might want to store your Bitcoin without a bank account. It is the electronic equivalent of a wallet holding the cash in your pocket. That is basically what an unhosted wallet is. It's a wallet that holds your Bitcoin in a way that your physical wallet would hold your US dollars. So by classifying wallets or wallet providers as brokers, you're essentially putting the individual almost, or if you're talking about a wallet provider, I guess the company who made your leather wallet, like Coach, if you have like a Coach leather wallet, like you're saying that they're the same thing as like a bank or a stock exchange, or they're like Coinbase, basically. Like obviously that's not true. The goal behind the policy, now this is an IRS action, so tax collections presumably is the goal, but the ramifications would be very sweeping. You could loop it into the Bank Secrecy Act and sanctions regime. Talk about freezing assets and seizing assets and reappropriating assets. Then you're subjecting what is in effect people's physical cash to those regulatory structures. But in the United States, there's always been a right to privacy. There's always been a right to sock money under your mattress or put gold bars in a safe. You know, there's always kind of been this right for people to try to be as self-sovereign as possible. And look, we saw some mid-range banks going out of business like a year ago, you know? And there's been a robust debate on how much the FDIC should be insuring those assets. I think that should, in people's minds, reinforce the desire to have some element of your savings, some element of your property be truly self-sovereign, be self-hosted, if you will. And so this notion of taking away that option for people, I find extreme and factually and legally wrong. Like, your wallet is not a broker. Like, obviously these are two different things. A broker is something that is, facilitating sales amongst people or facilitating exchange amongst people, and at some point custodying the assets. And so they need to be have certain rules about knowing who's on either side of the transaction and at the time of day where that transaction took place, making sure that you're not double selling the same asset, like stuff like that. There's certain rules where it makes sense. It can make sense to treat certain entities like a broker, but treating what is in effect someone's wallet with cash in it as a broker doesn't even make logical sense, let alone legal sense. But when you think about the motivation of control, they want to control. They don't want people to have self-sovereignty, I think, or be able to avoid the watchful eye of government. Then it puts it in perspective, and you start to realize, why it's such bad policy, frankly, why it's not just illogical, but why it's bad policy. So I don't know. That's a bit of a rant on that issue, but it's very frustrating that the government is, in the absence of any legislative clarity from Congress, because they can't put their shoes on and tie them without just sending money to Ukraine instead of actually clarifying rules for domestic industries. In the absence of any action by Congress, the agencies are left to their own devices to kind of make it up as they go. And unfortunately, they've made it up the wrong way. This is not the first time the IRS has, I believe, made a mistake in this area of the law. The way they tax Bitcoin miners on the income from mining Bitcoin, I think, is incorrect. It should be treated like a commodity, like gold or oil, when you pull it out of the ground and then you later sell it. You realize some profit, then you can be taxed. But now they're taxing miners on at the moment they mine the Bitcoin, and then also when they sell the Bitcoin. Again, because there's no legislative clarity from members on the Hill. So the agency's just guessing, or if you want to give it a less charitable reading, they're stretching the bounds of their authority to preserve their own power, which of course bureaucracies exist to do so frequently. So again, I've gone on way too long about this. It's just, I think it's a very dangerous policy proposal. The industry has come out very strongly against it. I think there will be litigation, and hopefully it'll be struck down. But you can't just decide that a human being with cash in their wallet or with a cold storage wallet, that they are the same thing as Coinbase or a stock exchange or something like that. I mean, it makes no sense, and it's bad policy.
I really like the analogy you used of a Coach wallet. Or, it could be a J.Crew wallet. It could be any wallet provider. And we're talking physical wallets here. I think of my parents' and grandparents' generation. They're very cash-based still. I mean, sure, they have credit cards, but I see a lot of people in the older generations, they still use cash when they go to the grocery store, when they go to a restaurant, or, when they're...
I see it all the time.
It's everywhere, right?
Of course, yeah.
And so effectively what this rule would do is, suppose every time you paid somebody in cash, you had to report that to the IRS. it would just be completely illogical. It'd be absurd. It would be a burden upon the individual cash user that they wouldn't be able to bear. And I think that's the design behind the broker rule. It's to kill Bitcoin holders with death by 1,000 paper cuts. Just the amount of paperwork you'd have to go through and you'd have to file every year, and the accountants you would have to pay to make sure that all your transactions are 100% correct. It's just impossible to comply with this kind of rule. It's too onerous. It's too much of a burden. But I think that's by design. I think that there are people within the administration who see Bitcoin and who see crypto generally as another area to be taxed, of course, and they are taxing it, to be clear. But this is just one more area where they can pull even more taxes from users. And in addition to that, deter them from using the asset itself, which I think plays into this to a certain extent. Curious your thoughts on that, Brian.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as I said, this is the desire for control is very strong. The desire for visibility into every single transaction. I have heard many members' offices on the Hill talk about, well, if you're using money for illicit purposes, like $1 or one sat is one too many. That is so simplistic and ridiculous. At every society and every device that's ever created in society is going to be used the wrong way by somebody for some purpose. It is always a balancing act between preserving the integrity of a system, between preserving public safety, world peace, your food supply, whatever it is. You need to, safety. Like, we have to wear a seatbelt when we get in a car, but you're still allowed to drive a car, right? People still get in car accidents. People still get injured in car accidents. If you leave the house at some point during the day, there will be something that can hurt you potentially. So this notion that you're going to eliminate 100% of all risks at any cost is absurd. And we saw that attitude from Washington, of course, during the coronavirus pandemic, where they wanted everybody to be, wearing bubble wrap and trapped in their basement for 3 years. And it was horrifically damaging. Guess why? Because, well, number one, not everybody was at high risk. Some people were, and they should be more cautious. It's not necessarily the role of the government to tell everybody they can't go to work or go to school or go to church or do anything else. But of course, social justice protests are fine. Sidebar. The point is, everything comes with some risks. You have to balance those risks with reasonable regulations. There has to be a bounds of reasonability. That's what the rational basis test for constitutional rights, at least, that has been articulated by the Supreme Court. It's the lowest level scrutiny, but even the lowest level scrutiny, the law has to meet a rational basis test. It has to, the means and the ends have to kind of line up. This notion that you're going to prevent 100% of harm, no matter what, at all costs, means you're going to have a surveillance state. And do you remember the quote, those who sacrificed liberty for security deserve neither?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin. Like, we need to get back to our roots. We need to get back to, rational thought. Like, just calm down. In terms of these sorts of regulations, preventing illicit finance, for example, in the digital asset space, by far the largest number of users and transactions you're looking at are going to be some of these centralized exchanges. There you're getting at 95% or something of all the transactions. And then if you're looking at on-chain transactions, some, much, much smaller percentage. You have a lot of the analytic tools that we've talked about where if you're targeting, for example, people carrying out some kind of violent attacks or some other awful thing, we've gotten quite good at tracking down funds, used for illicit purposes. But point being, we're talking about, we're getting down to the individual now, getting into people's personal lives, into their bedrooms, probably quite literally. Like, if you're talking about somebody who just wants their privacy and they are distrustful of some institutions, they want to do the, gold bar or cash under their mattress for some amount of their savings just to be totally self-sufficient. Like, you may not like that. You might think that's kooky or whatever, but this is a free country. You're supposed to have the freedom to do what you want. And if you think that's going to preserve your savings in the best way, then you should be allowed to do that. Taking away that right, taking away the right to shield absolutely anything from the government is just un-American, and it's a knee-jerk reaction that I keep seeing from politicians and policymakers in Washington, and it's driving me crazy. So I think we got to keep speaking up. We got to keep talking to people about it, and hopefully we can get sort of more of a tide towards liberty and away from the surveillance state that is just growing and growing and growing.
I couldn't agree more. You said that this desire within policy circles to eliminate all risks wherever they may be, whether it be finance or public health or global trade or even crime, is just completely unrealistic.
No, crime is fine, apparently, because they're not prosecuting crimes anymore. So that's fine. Actual physical risk to your body, yeah, we'll just tolerate all kinds of that. But if you want to evade $1 in taxes, which they're not going to spend very well, then we're going to come down on your head with the fist of God. I mean, It's crazy.
Right. Absolutely insane. And not only is it unrealistic, it's un-American. I mean, risk is one of the most fundamentally American ideas that exists. Think about our ancestors. They took huge levered longs on their futures to cross the Atlantic Ocean and land on these shores with really no prospects for the future. And they took an enormous risk to build the nation that we live in today. Our nation was built on risk. That's why it's become the nation where capital markets have thrived as much as they have. It's because this is a nation for risk takers. It's people who are willing to bet on their futures and bet on the innate human ability to build things and to make something out of nothing. And that's what I think is so disturbing about this culture of safetyism that we've seen overtake Washington circles. And like you said, this was so pronounced during COVID. I remember Governor Cuomo said, one life lost to COVID is one life too many. It's like, okay, well, by that very logic, we're going to close down all the schools. We're going to close down all the businesses. We're going to shut down the economy for as long as we possibly need to make sure that not one life is lost to COVID. And think of how many lives were irreparably harmed as a result of that insane safetyist mindset. We need to take risks. We need to take calculated risks. I'm not saying we should just go no holds barred in policy circles, but we need to be cautious where it's appropriate, but we have to take chances on the future. And we have to have some wiggle room there because that's where entrepreneurs thrive. And when you have the all-seeing eye of Sauron, the US government wanting to put their nose in every transaction that happens between Americans, we've really lost something as a country if we allow that to happen. So it's my hope that that never happens. And to close this out, Brian, sometimes we do draft tweets. Sometimes we just give each other some space for our own monologues. But yeah, curious if you have any thoughts on anything we've touched on today, or if you have any draft tweets in mind or anything you want to say to close us out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the Ukraine vote and the cheering on the House floor and waving the Ukrainian flags. I mean, I think my draft tweet would have been way too long for a tweet, but the thoughts it conjured up, we just finished, tax day just recently. So I think the American people are particularly sensitive to like where their tax dollars going, and why are they paying so much of them, and why are they being wasted? We're just in a place now where up is down, down is up, bad is good, good is bad. You have, I think, what was a preventable war that was prevented, two preventable wars that were prevented, at least during the Trump administration, then reaching, hot kinetic levels, resulting in thousands of deaths, tragically. And now U.S. and then you had a closed border. So you had peace. Now we have war. You had effectively a closed border. Now you have an open border. People flooding into the country. You have crime running rampant in our cities. You have people who took on student debt, just having it wiped out and having it passed on to people who paid their bills or didn't take on the debt. Um, you have rampant inflation, and the government's solution seems to be print more money when that's obviously the cause of the inflation. Um, it is, you have a leading candidate for president on trial for something that's not a crime. An NDA, paying somebody to stop talking, is a contractual relationship like as old as the country. I mean, you might not think it's a great thing, but it's not a crime. It reached this feeling. You now have the government trying to tell people they cannot have cash in their wallets, in effect, because we need to know what you're doing. We need to get into your life. And going back to the COVID discussion, like, you could go out and break into stores and steal stuff, but you weren't allowed to go to church or to school. Again, I feel like we are in just an upside down world right now. Good is bad, bad is good. And it is definitely weakening Americans' trust in institutions. It's weakening their trust in their government. It's weakening the power of the US dollar. And like I said, it's all bullish for Bitcoin because people are like, I got to get off the grid. We are living in a crazy world. But that makes me sad as an American. Makes, just to see our leaders destroying the country that I love. I really hope that people are waking up. I hope our leaders in Washington are starting to hear them and starting to get their act together and realize I was supposed to be elected to represent my constituents, not whatever the heck is going on here. I hope we're reaching an inflection point because I'm at a point where I feel like we're living in an upside down world, and I hope people wake up soon. So that's a pretty somber note to end on. I hope we can end on blue steel and make it like a little bit of a happier moment here. But yeah, I'm sad about where things have gone recently, and I hope that they turn around very fast.
Yeah, sorry, I'll do blue steel to close this out. But it's funny you mentioned that because I felt the same way over the weekend. I felt kind of depressed, to be honest, for all those reasons that you mentioned. And I think I also had sort of the hangover from paying taxes after tax day and really going through the mental process of where's this money going and how's it being used? And that's what got me down. Because I realized that with, different, let's just talk about short-term capital gains taxes for a second. When people trade stocks, crypto, anything, between 10 to 37% of their profit will go to the federal government. And so let's suppose somebody trades crypto and they make money on it. 37% of that profit will go to a government that is actively trying to destroy crypto as an industry. Yep. It will go to help fund a White House that is actively trying to choke off Bitcoin mining and to make it almost illegal to even hold Bitcoin. It's going to a Congress who is spending willy-nilly financing our children's and grandchildren's futures to finance forever wars that have very little to do with the security of the United States at the present moment, all the while letting the border situation continue to deteriorate by the day. That's what got me depressed. I would be happy to pay taxes if I felt like the government was actually there defending me, whether it means defending my physical safety or the entrepreneurialism I believe in. But at the present moment, it doesn't feel that way. And I think a lot of Americans are becoming disillusioned by that fact. I think as a country, we're suffering from a form of mass Stockholm syndrome to think that this is all normal, that this is all okay. It goes back to your great Mark Cuban diatribe last week, where he said, I'm happy to pay over $200 million in taxes. It's like, really? You are? Because I'm like super poor compared to you. And I'm not happy to do that. I'll do it because,
I'll go to jail if I don't.
I'll go to jail if I don't. But there needs to be so much more accountability for our government that just isn't there at the present moment.
That's a really powerful point. We just got through tax day. And now with this new bill that is being rushed through Congress, American people are seeing their hard-earned dollars go not to stop crime in their neighborhood, not to protect the borders of the United States, not to protect their freedom to transact or to save money or to build wealth for their family. It's going to prosecute forever wars halfway around the world, and it's going to fund a government that's trying to now take away their freedom to do those things that we just talked about. Like I said, upside down. Good is bad, bad is good. It's very unfortunate. And I think, the American people need to take the power back, and they need to let their elected leaders know that they're not okay with the status quo, that things have to be reversed. We got to go back to the first principles of what America stands for, and we will have a thriving country. That's what got us to the place that we were in the post-World War II era, where we became a superpower. We need to return to that. When you look at an online trend recently has been men thinking about the Roman Empire. I am one of those men. And, some of the reasons why the Roman Empire collapsed were costly foreign entanglements. It was not focusing on keeping the Roman people strong and healthy and self-sovereign and providing for, an exceptional Roman experience. It ended up eroding trust among the people. It made them vulnerable to foreign attack. You can't defend a bankrupt nation. And I just am seeing a lot of parallels to today. I don't think all is lost. I think we can turn things around, but we need more of the American people to wake up to help make that happen. And you're seeing it with like people turning to sources of media like this instead of just trusting what they hear in mainstream media, which is really designed to sell advertising and sell clicks, not to tell you the truth. So, but I'm glad that more people are sort of waking up. I just hope it's not too late, and I hope we are able to get a call to action here and make a difference. So, buy Bitcoin, follow us on Twitter at MorganSternNJ, at Sam Lyman33. Hit that subscribe button. Come back and join us whenever we have a new episode. Tell us what you think. Write comments. If you think we're dumb and you don't like us, hate mail is fun too. If you do like us, that's even better. Write us love letters. Maybe we'll read them on the pod if we get any love letters. But anyway, this has been a very deep discussion. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I hope we made it somewhat light and interesting. And come on back and join us next time.